Hi, and hello, this is Philip Grindell from Diffuse Global. Today, what I'm going to be doing is talking about some of the security terminology that we use. Too often I find myself in meetings and in environments where I'm questioning whether people actually understand the terminology. So, simple terms like risk and threat and vulnerability. Do people really know what those words mean within a security concept? And equally, when they're talking about threat assessment or risk assessment, what do they actually mean? Do they understand how those concepts are made up, and therefore, how to dismantle them and diffuse the risk or the threat? So, what I thought I would do is just talk about some of those things that, from my perspective and from my experience, and what those words and terms mean and how they all fit together. So, let's start with risk. The thing about a risk is it's quite a subjective terminology. It's a forward projected view of what something's going to be like. And fundamentally what it is the amount of harm that is likely should nothing be done. So if you do nothing, what's the risk, if you like? It's called a risk assessment because it's not an exact science. You're making an assessment based on what you know now. Of course, that means it's a continuous process, so you're constantly re-evaluating that risk, and it means that it can go up or down. Now, one of the other issues around risk is that it depends on your experience and your level of appetite or tolerance where you assess that risk to be. Someone like myself, for instance, who's been doing this for 35 years and has been in high threat environments and high risk environments will have a very different appetite for risk and a tolerance of risk than someone that's never done it before in their life, and therefore has a different viewpoint and different values and culture and everything else to go with it. And the other thing to understand is that the likelihood is, if you're a security professional as opposed to a client, you will have a different view on what that is to your client. So you, the client, may be sat there, and I hope there's clients listening to this because it's important that they understand what these terminology, what the terms mean as well. The client may be sitting there thinking this is really high risk and this is really high threat, and you may have a different perspective. So it's important to understand the terminology. It's important to be able to explain that so you can give them a good account of why you've reached certain views and assessments. So effectively, it's made up of an equation, and that is that threat times vulnerability equals the impact. So that's what risk is. Risk is threat times vulnerability and impact. And the thing about risk is, I've always been taught, and I've always believed, there's no such thing as low risk. The risk is either unknown or above. So if someone says to you it's low risk, then I would always challenge that point, because that is saying that they are making that assessment that their risk is low. And arguably what they mean is they don't have enough information, which is why we call it unknown risk. So as I said, threat and vulnerability equals impact. So let's move on to what threat means, because that's a term that gets used an awful lot, and I'm sometimes dubious about whether people really, again, understand that. Threat is intention plus capability, and you have to have both components to be able to make a threat. So again, what that means is that you have to intend something to happen and have the capability to make it happen. If either one of those components is not there, then it is not a threat, or the threat doesn't exist. If we were to firstly say, who talks about threats, who makes threats? Well, there's different terminology again for those individuals. Some people call it threat actors, when it's sort of more state-based in terms of a nation state or ISIS or something like that. When it's kind of individually based, it's often referred to as a subject or a person of concern or whatever term they want to use. But whatever term you use, in my view, there are two pieces of the jigsaw that are always the same. So whether they are a political extremist, whether they're a terrorist, a criminal, a computer hacker, a fixated person, a protester, or someone posing an insider threat, they have two things in common. And that is, one, they're looking to explore your vulnerabilities, and two, they're almost certainly driven by some grievance. The only anomaly possibly is the hackers who would sometimes argue that they're doing it for for good, in terms of they think they can exploit vulnerabilities and demonstrate those vulnerabilities. And that may be the case. But certainly, generally speaking, particularly with the field that I work in, which is kind of targeted, planned violence or planned attacks, is nearly always grievance driven. So the term intent is effectively meaning a desire to cause harm. So that, if I give you a couple of examples around how that equation in terms of intent and capability comes about. So let's think about the US government. The US government have got all the capability in the world to probably destroy every country in the world, but they don't have the necessary intent. So they don't pose that threat to people. Now, if we take it back to a sort of my world and a more sort of simplistic environment, a high-profile person will have friends and confidants who will know their secrets, who will have proximity to them, who will have all sorts of access to them, but they don't have that intent. Therefore, they don't pose a threat to them. If we flip that on the head, you might say that North Korea has intent or Iran has intent to cause harm to various places. But they don't necessarily have the capability. And in fact, a lot of what's going on at the moment is where they are trying to limit that capability so they don't have a threat. Because if they have intent and capability equals threat, because we know they have the intent, if we can prevent the capability, no threat, or certainly much reduced threat. So again, back to the real world, a person, for instance, who might be targeting or abusing a high-profile person on the internet or on social media, they may have lots of intent to cause you harm, but in terms of the capability, it's limited. Now, I say that because there is some capability of causing harm psychologically to you online, but in terms of causing you physical danger or physical harm, they probably lack the capability. They don't have your diary. They don't know when your events are. They don't have that proximity to you. They probably don't have access to weapons that they would need. So again, unless they have both parts of the intent and capability, the threat is significantly diminished. So then let's move on to the sort of next piece of the jigsaw, which is vulnerability. So vulnerability is effectively about gaps and weaknesses. And what we're talking here is chinks in your armor, your Achilles heel. So we all put up various barriers around us. We all use security in our daily basis in terms of we put locks and things on our house. Some people put a great deal more because they feel there's a greater threat. Therefore, they need to up their security to reduce their vulnerability. In the same way, we look at our cyber and passwords and that sort of stuff. The truth of the matter is that if the Chinese government or the Russian government or somebody wanted to get into my systems or your systems, they invariably would be able to do so because they've got the capability to do that. But because we don't perceive that to be likely, we don't necessarily need to have the security to counter that. So our security will be less, and therefore our vulnerability will be more. And that's based on the proportionality argument about, well, what am I vulnerable to? So for instance, in terms of your home security, if you are someone who is extremely vulnerable, then you're going to have greater level of security around your property where you're living than you would if you're not someone who's vulnerable. So depending on what your vulnerability is, depending where your gaps or weaknesses are, depends what you would do. Now, in terms of organizations, one of the key elements about organizations is they generally lack awareness about how vulnerable they are. And we routinely see organizations, be they universities, public services, private businesses, charities, what have you, being compromised. And sometimes that's because they lack the awareness of the value of some of the data and intellectual property they have. I mean, if you're a nation state, you don't need to do loads of research if you can just go and steal it off a university. So, it's probably very simple to hack most universities and get into their databases, or in other circumstances, get someone into the university or get someone into those environments, and with the insider threat, steal that information. So again, that's two areas of vulnerability that they would have to look at, and invariably, they're probably not quite up to scratch in the level of internet security or IT security because of the threat they're actually facing. So again, those are the sorts of areas of vulnerability. Now, the third part of the consequence of it, also the last part of the sort of jigsaw of this, is the impact. Now, I will say there's one other piece which certainly in the police we used to use quite a bit, was likelihood, and I'll kind of touch on that a bit later. But impact is important, because if there is no impact or no consequences to what happens, then actually you're going to take that risk. So I'll give you an example. When I was a young PC, one of the most sort of popular shops in Covent Garden had no security whatsoever, and they always had shoplifters. But their argument was, well, you know, the impact of us having all those clothes stolen is financial, but actually, in order to us to prevent doing that, we'd have to put and pay for lots of security, which is basically cancelling out the amount that we would have stolen. So we'd rather just not bother about security and let people steal stuff. And that was their view, because the impact on them, they felt, was low. In the same way that if someone is targeting someone online, as an example, and that impact on them is very low, then actually the threat is quite low as well, because you know it's not going to harm you. So if you're being blackmailed, for instance, as an example, if you're being blackmailed about your sexuality, for instance, and actually you're quite open about your sexuality, the harm, the impact will be less. So the impact is the consequences, the kind of so what. But one of the interesting bits about that is it's difficult to quantify kind of immediately, because that's how a lot of people think about things. But certainly we looked at 9/11 and other kind of terrorist incidents. What often happened is there was the immediate physical impact, the kind of deaths, the destruction. Certainly there was a psychological impact to the city or the people and the families and the country as a whole. But what was less obvious initially was the financial impact to that place. So, you know, if London gets bombed, then yes, there's all that physical tragedy and damage to buildings, etc. But the longer term consequences might be we don't have so much tourism. So that's a slower, longer term consequence impact of that attack. And the sorts of consequences we're looking at are reputational harm, loss of intellectual property, customer confidence if you're a business and you have your data stolen, certainly psychological harm, probably all of those ones, but particularly with online areas in the work that I do, certainly financial consequences, and of course physical harm. So those are the various bits. Now I'm hoping my IT skills are up to scratch now when I share my screen with you, because what I want to show you now is this what's called a risk, the risk matrix, or the risk chain, in fact. So if I'm just, bear with me, I will share my screen and hopefully you will see that. So what this talks about here is that if you understand the terminology and you understand how intention and capability equals threat, and threat and vulnerability equals impact, and then impact, you know, obviously equals risk, that's where you know which bonds you need to deal with to minimize the threat, or in my case, diffuse, no pun intended. So if you want to diffuse a threat, then you need to deal with one of the intentions or the capability. So if you know they've got the intention, you can prevent them getting the capability. If you think they've got the capability, let's try and work on their intentions and actually work on that side of it. Equally, if you know that the threat exists, then you need to close the vulnerability. So by closing that vulnerability, you reduce the likelihood of attack and therefore the impact as well. So therefore you're reducing the risk. So by understanding what these terms mean and how they all fit together, it enables you to far more professionally minimize or diffuse threats. And if the threat exists, how you diffuse the risks. Anyway, I hope that's really useful to everyone. Listen, you know, if everyone wants to contact me, wants some further information, or wants to talk about it, or you know, perhaps you feel that there is a threat or a risk to you, and you want to talk about it, it's Philip Grindale at Diffuse Global, diffuseglobal.com. Thank you very much.